Good afternoon. I know it's been a while, a couple of weeks since my last short story, maybe even 3, but I'm getting there. I'm beginning to write again. And the random word concept of pulling titles out of a hat and then writing a story inspired by that title is kind of working, finally. So I've got another story for you today, but before we get to that, I just want to let you know that my second short story collection, The Museum of Forgotten Toys, is released on Friday the 1st of December. That's right, you can buy this lovely paperback edition there. Or for just $3.99, I believe, $4.99 possibly in the UK, you can buy an ebook version of it. So you can pre-order now. I think you can maybe only pre-order the ebook, but the paperback, the lovely shiny paperback, which contains 48 short stories, many of which I've read on this channel, but not all of them by any means. So get a copy. And enough sales pitch. I'm going to read you the story. This is story number 165, and it's called Moonpods. It was ridiculous, really, juvenile even. While others were using their pods to tell a dying loved one how they really felt, or reconnect with a long-lost friend, here was Jake attempting once more to tell his ex-boss Julia to fuck right off. Moonpods, such a strange yet appropriate name for wonderful isolation devices that could transport the user to any imaginable world, whether existing, long gone, or entirely invented. It was a brilliant business concept to combine the relaxing effect of an isolation tank with the power of lucid dreaming, as brought to full fruition by the brilliantly charismatic, if somewhat controversial, psychotherapist Dr. Justin Patterson. Not for Patterson the traditional conscious deep delve into the psyche. Instead of interlocutory methods of psychoanalysis, Patterson taught the art of lucid dreaming, a mixture of self-hypnosis and the ingestion of regulated quantities of a psychotropic drug called moondust. Both pods and drug were trademarked, patented, and protected by an army of intellectual property lawyers. Lucida's IPO had netted Patterson billions. Jake was no stranger to therapy, having been provided with NHS-funded counselling after recovering from his heart attack and breakdown. The CBT sessions hadn't worked. 8 weeks into therapy, Jake still experienced gut-knotting fear when driving past the huge distribution warehouse where he'd been logistics manager. Imagine how it would feel to actually walk through the front doors. He shivered thinking about it, having had the worst day of his life there, a day that had almost ended him. So you're not going to ask me any questions about my mother or my sex life or anything like that? Jake asked at his first Lucida appointment. It's not that kind of session, the stylishly middle-aged Dr. Louise Featherstone replied, smiling. You didn't get Patterson as your therapist unless you shelled out the big bucks. It says in the leaflet, you hold the secret to your own healing deep inside. We'll hand you that secret. What does that mean exactly? The ad copy is a little cheesy, but it's basically accurate, Dr. Featherstone answered. We found that following Dr. Patterson's system, our patients learn to control their own experiences and destiny by role-playing alternative life paths, experiencing alternate realities, and all within the safe confines of their own minds. Jake gave an involuntary gasp of laughter. It sounded absurd. All that from dreams? Lucid dreams, Dr. Featherstone corrected. It'll feel entirely real, except you'll have your spirit guide there to remind you it's a dream. That's important? It's vital. We don't want you to become adrift. Adrift? Don't let that concern you at this point. All you need to know right now is that whatever is holding you back, whatever unrealized ambition, inchoate fear, or unexpurgated trauma, the Moonpod will set you free. I get all that from a dream? Mr. Holdsworth, what else are dreams for? By the time he left Featherstone's immaculate consultation room, Jake had already committed. He swiped his credit card at reception and signed up to the 12-week program. A dozen 2-hour sessions plus a delivery of his own uniquely coded moondust tincture, engineered from DNA data from the mouth swab he'd given. The package arrived 3 days later with 24 individually wrapped sachets, like artisanal tea bags. Circles of infused rice paper you held under your tongue, like a communion wafer, until they dissolved. Until you dissolved. The training hadn't gone well at first. Jake had been resistant and guarded, unwilling to unlock the secret chambers of his own mind, according to Dr. Featherstone. The breakthrough came on week 3, when for a minute or so, Jake managed to revisit his first date with Bianca, his now estranged wife. The one he'd called an emasculating bitch during their last telephone exchange 8 months ago. The last thing he'd said to her. Jake found himself walking with Bianca, blissfully down the autumnal canal towpath, taking her hand for the first time. Only the light, brisk footsteps of his spirit animal, the golden retriever Macbeth, trotting along behind them, reminding him that this wasn't actually happening. The memory had lain concealed within him for almost 30 years, and he'd brought it back to vivid life, just for an instant. Jake was momentarily distracted by a bus passing on one of the roads that crisscrossed the canal, and the memory shivered, faded, and vanished into inky black nothingness. He awoke, cocooned in the warm amniotic goo, as the last buzz of the delicious memory left him, and Dr. Featherstone's voice popped into his single earbud. "I saw a spike. Was that—" She sounded breathlessly excited. He'd been one of her most recalcitrant patients. "It was incredible. It felt as if I was really there. There were details, sights, sounds, and smells that were incredibly vivid. Better than a memory." Dreams are more powerful than memories. They're kind of an action replay, with imagination filling in the gaps. A bit like one of those AI apps that creates imagery. Sort of, Featherstone acknowledged. Except your mind is more powerful than any AI we currently have. In our next session, we may even teach you how to control it. The thought excited him immediately. In truth, Jake couldn't say for certain whether the move to take Bianca's hand on the towpath had been a decision or just a memory. What if it had been a decision? What if next time he could take her in his arms and kiss her? The excitement of that notion came tempered with a bit of shame. She'd broken up with him, after all, long ago. Would this be a form of virtual abuse? Featherstone seemed to read his mind. There is no morality in dreaming. That's its point and purpose. I've treated men and women with far darker desires than your own, Mr. Holdsworth, would-be murderers who've taken their revenge. Even paedophiles who, well, I hesitate to imagine. Because these acts occur in a purely imaginary space, they can, if properly shepherded, prove protective, prevent people acting out in reality. Jake wasn't sure about this last claim. The notion of helping paedophiles to enact their depraved desires, even in imagination, nauseated him. But Featherstone was the professional, and who was he to question her? It put his own rather lame plans for catharsis into perspective, though. Why should he feel any guilt or shame about putting an avatar of his manipulative, abusive boss in her place? And so Jake continued with the sessions, and his doubts and concerns faded into a practical desire to impress his trainer. On session 4, remarkably, he managed to manifest his own spirit guide, not as his pet Labrador Macbeth, but as a human. It turned out to be the reasonable facsimile of Dr. Justin Patterson himself. His cadaverous countenance, wry smile, and fierce dark eyebrows were all present and correct, and just slightly caricatured. His waistcoats were as brightly patterned as they appeared in reality, and his gait was appropriately sprightly. He walked just slightly ahead of them down the towpath, although his voice appeared in the middle of Jake's head, rather than in his ear, and Bianca evidently couldn't detect his presence at all. "You're very lucky," Featherstone said when Jake relayed his dream experiences to her after that third session. "Very few seem to manifest Dr. Patterson. He seems oddly reluctant to do cameos." Her own little joke, which she delivered in her usual deadpan manner. "I've been watching a lot of his YouTube videos," explained Jake, missing the humour in the moment. "It feels like he's been guiding me for weeks." "Then you'll no longer need me in your ear," Featherstone replied. "You've acquired an upgrade." By session 7, Jake had begun to enact decisions within the dream state, gently prompted by virtual Patterson. At first, Jake avoided any proximity to his workplace, yet returned time and time again to the canal. Things kept changing. The season, the width of the towpath, Bianca's outfit, Macbeth's age. He went from eager puppy to waddling 15-year-old and back in rapid succession. However, the general thread of their romantic walk continued. Testing his freedom that first time, Jake reached for Bianca's hand, swinging her round into an embrace, while leaning back against the mossy wall of the canal as it passed beneath a major road. Bianca laughed and leaned in to kiss him, her tongue warm and exploratory, exactly as he remembered it. After a moment or two of delicious trysting, Jake pulled away from the kiss first, feeling the first stirrings of real lust. He could feel Dr. Patterson's eyes upon him, and it rendered him shy and self-conscious. Dream Bianca, obligingly, seemed not to notice anything amiss, and they continued their walk, still hand in hand. "Could I get Dr. Patterson to walk behind us out of sight?" Jake asked Dr. Featherstone, after awakening and drying the translucent warm gel from his body behind the screens. She laughed. "Mr. Holdsworth, you can have him disappear entirely if you like, or transform into a flock of parrots. Anything you'd like. But I recommend you keep his voice to guide you." As the weeks progressed, Jake had Patterson fade gradually into the background, leaving just the whisper of his voice to remind him that everything he was experiencing was a construct of his own memory and imagination. His skills blossomed in weeks 7 to 9, and he began to embellish reality playfully, appearing in a top hat and tails during one canal-side walk, or upscaling his environment into a fantastical version of the Panama Canal, except with Mississippi riverboats instead of container ships. He decided to reposition his workplace at the canal's end, so he could segue into his true mission by the end of the training program. Dr. Featherstone thought this a sensible idea, although by week 10 she was gently critiquing his choice of imaginings. "Mr. Holdsworth," "Jake, please, do call me Jake." "Jake, you can literally visit the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, or go dancing in the Cotton Club, or ride on the back of a brontosaurus. Do you really want to keep walking that stretch of canal?" Jake found it hard to construct a response. In a sense, Dr. Featherstone had an excellent point. Why was he so intent on revisiting this prosaic little moment with Bianca? Perhaps it was because he felt he needed to perfect his imaginative skills before embarking on the quest that would psychologically unblock him. Day-tripping within his own psyche, becoming some sort of vicarious psycho-tourist, would threaten that mission. He worried that he'd become distracted and lose his way, and he told Dr. Featherstone as much. "As you wish," was all she had to say. Jake suspected she was becoming a little bored with him. He made a conscious decision to progress rapidly towards the confidence that would let him cross the threshold of Zambezi logistics. The final breakthrough came when, on week 11, Bianca, who until that moment had seemed content to walk with him in silence, turned to him and said, "It's lovely to see you, Jake." This version of the canal towpath was unusually wintry and realistic, like he decided to set this dreamscape inside an early 1980s Ken Loach film. Jake was already shivering slightly, seemingly unable to imagine up a scarf, when her words made him start and step away from her. Jake suddenly saw Bianca as a walking, talking entity with a degree of autonomy. How could that be possible? She was, after all, literally a figment of his imagination. "Yes, it is lovely," he replied thinly, a tad chilly, mind. Bianca smiled her slightly askew smile and thrust her hands, still clasping his, into the pockets of her woolen coat. He bumped shoulders with her as she pulled him alongside. "Let's hurry up and get back to our cosy little cottage and get a real fire going," she said, a note of urgency entering her voice. What was this? Jake no longer seemed to be controlling things. "It happens," came the voice of Dr. Patterson. "When your skills develop, characters in your imagination can take on something of a life of their own." That seemed rather paradoxical, but Jake let it go. He had a plan in mind. He had to progress his mission, and now he'd figured out how. "Bianca, would you mind if I just popped into work? There's something I need to do. It will only take a minute." It felt ridiculous even asking, since she would surely do as he suggested. For a moment, however, Bianca did not reply. She turned briefly to watch a pair of swans trailing 3 grey, fluffy cygnets glide up the dark waters beneath the bridge. Then she turned, squeezed his hand, and smiled. "Of course. There's a shortcut just there, isn't there?" Bianca tilted her head, indicating a gap in the railings a little way along the towpath. A small gravel walkway led between willow trees to a yard of loading docks, where, Even now, lorries were collecting their consignments. The beeping of their reversing alarms made a strangely mournful, minimalist music. Beyond the docks, the blue corrugated iron warehouse stood, with its 1,000,000 cubic feet of shelving and 4.7 million boxes ready for inventorying, scheduling, and transportation. The very thought of it made Jake tense with discomfort. "Remember, this is all a dream, Jake," came Patterson's wry whisper. "You're invincible. Nothing here can harm you." As soon as Jake remembered that this was a dream he was experiencing, things began to turn a little strange. The warehouse was now far too dimly lit. The health and safety inspector would have shut the place down if in reality it had ever been so gloomy. The aisles between shelving were infinitely extended, receding to the horizon. The robot stackers now looked menacing. They were huge, towering overhead like something from a nightmare version of a Transformers movie. Jake felt the need to hide from them, ducking from shelving unit to shelving unit. Furtively, he made his way down the aisle to where the offices were located. A trapezoid of striped light fell across the concrete floor from Julia's office window. The head of distribution for Zambezi was very much in, her blinds angled to let only thin slashes of light spill out into the warehouse. It was all slightly sinister, like a scene from a film noir. "Don't worry if everything seems heightened and sparsely populated at the same time," his version of Dr. Patterson advised. "Your imagination and memory aren't limitless. They'll only give you what matters most." If this were true, why hadn't he encountered a single colleague? He'd always got on well with forklift driver Rosie, foreman Bill, and head of packaging Lionel, to name but 3 of his work friends. Why weren't they there to support him? Perhaps because in reality they'd stop him. Technically, Jake was still on extended sick leave. He could, in theory, return to work if he so chose. Stymieing his chances like this, when his finances were precarious at best, wasn't the wisest course of action, even in a simulation. But there are things more important than money, thought Jake as he stepped up to Julia's door and rapped on the frosted glass pane. Things like self-respect, pride, and justice. This woman had belittled, humiliated, and browbeaten him for years. "Come!" True to form, Julia Helmsley wasted no more words than was necessary. Jake cleared his throat in preparation. He marched in, swinging the door wide. It clattered back against the thin plaster wall, but Julia didn't even look up from her desk. She sat immobile in a cone of light thrown by a green-shaded anglepoise. Jake had rehearsed this moment many times, preparing his case and assembling his arguments, clarifying his reasoning for allowing Julia to shriek at him in front of the assembled warehouse staff, or force him to work 27 hours one weekend, missing his wife's birthday drinks. But as he began to ready his opening salvo, Jake noticed that Julia was staring fixedly at a photo of her and her husband, taken many years previously on the skiing holiday where they'd become engaged. How he knew these details was a mystery. He was almost certainly inventing them in the spur of a dangerously empathic moment. Now, as if abruptly becoming aware of his presence, she looked up, and her cheeks looked puffy and wet. Other than these subtle clues, Julia's face was its usual Botoxed mask of indeterminate age. The boys in the warehouse had run a book, in cahoots with an HR person with access to her personnel file. They'd wagered on anything from 43 to 65 years of age. Despite her implacable countenance, Julia's red-rimmed eyelids and quavering lip revealed that she'd been crying. "He doesn't love me anymore, Jake," she said, startling him. This was unexpected and unprecedented. Why would his imagination throw this at him now? Jake felt himself harden, preparing a frown. "He's been having an affair," she continued, talking to herself as much as Jake. "It's been going on for years. A junior at the firm. Predictable, I suppose. It's not as if we'd been intimate recently." God, no, not this. Jake didn't want any of this. He wanted to speak his mind, deliver his self-righteous monologue and leave. The last thing he wanted was to feel sorry for her. Julia softly slid the photograph along her desk and into an open drawer, which she closed with exaggerated care. "Is there something I can do for you?" It wasn't delivered in her usual brisk, subtly undermining manner. It was a quiet, yet factual request for communication. Well, I've been thinking." "Really? Well, now we are in trouble, aren't we?" There was a hint of her old acerbic sense of humour, but it wasn't pointed his way as an act of unkindness. Was this how she used to talk to him? Surely it had been harsher. To be honest, he said, suddenly resigned, it's not important. Oh, Julia said, her voice and manner distant. Well, could you turn the light off on your way out? Jake looked into the pitch-black gloom, then back at Julia. She was pointing at the light switch. The light in here? She simply nodded. But you'll be left in the dark. His ex-boss smiled faintly, her top lip cracking into thin lines. I want to be. Jake backed away and pulled the door to, flicking off the light at the last moment. Darkness descended like a heavy woolen blanket. He found his dream fading like the closing scene of an art house movie. Dr. Patterson said nothing. He too had left the building. As ever, Jake awoke in the warm, dark gloop of the Moonpod, his ears stuffed with silence. He struggled to find the pale green LED disc that opened the hatch. When he finally emerged into the dimly lit row of pods in the lucid facility, it was with a feeling of immense relief. Jake didn't return to Lucida for 3 weeks to take up his last training session. By then, all desire to have it out virtually with Julia had faded. The dream had been telling him something, to let it go. He'd realized that someone who acted as viciously as Julia couldn't be a happy person. Why should he add to her stock of woes, or reheat his own? He'd find another job, one with manageable levels of stress and responsibility. As he relayed all this to Dr. Featherstone, she broke into a beaming smile. I'm glad, she announced brightly. You would never have received the closure you sought. Couldn't you have told me that before I wasted all those sessions? Who said they were wasted? His trainer-cum-therapist countered. What did you spend most of your time doing? Jake didn't have to think too long. Apparently his priorities had adjusted themselves in his subconscious since his last visit. The correct course of action seemed self-evident. I need to see her again, one more time. Say goodbye properly. Ever the professional, Dr. Featherstone didn't respond. It would be for Jake to decide how to spend his final session, or at least his final tutored one. He climbed into the warm ooze one more time, a wafer of moon dust dissolving in his bloodstream, and closed the hatch, his eye mask blocking out even the pale green circle of the escape button. Jake wanted to see her one more time. Bianca, not Julia. He had apologies to offer. In the dream world, and perhaps even in cold, drab reality. He'd say goodbye to the twisted vestige of hope he'd clung to for so long. Bianca, his wife of 17 years, wouldn't be coming back, and perhaps that was okay. Perhaps it was all okay. Perhaps okay is enough. I thank you. And that was Moonpods. It took me a while to write because that's quite a lengthy story, and I may do yet another draft before I send it anywhere. But I hope you enjoyed it. I will be back again sooner than you think, hopefully. As I say, if you like my stories, I would heartily recommend that you pre-order or on the 1st of December buy a copy of this book, where you'll find 48 of them. And that's all I have to say for now. Oh, actually, no, one more thing. Might as well do this. Let's find the next title for the next short story. Oh, very simple. You're reading it back to front, probably. But it says beckoning. Beckoning, there we go. Could be a lot of things. To find out, tune in next time. And thanks for listening. Goodbye for now.